So, I started volunteering at a wildlife refuge recently, and one of the resident animals is awfully weird. So, like I said, I started volunteering there about a month ago. I go in on Sundays and Saturdays for a 5-hour shift and basically just feed the animals, change their water, give medication to the ones who need it, and then discuss miscellaneous work. This is a wildlife refuge though, so the end goal is to return as many of the animals as we can that are delivered to us by animal control back to the wild as possible. So, some animals, for one reason or another, unfortunately can't go back to the wild because of injuries, imprinting, or what have you. These are resident animals who are permanent stays at the refuge. On my first day, the lady who runs the place gave me a tour. It's not a big place, maybe the size of a small park, with maybe 2 or 3 dozen animals of all species and all sizes at any given time. She showed me where the raccoons are, where the possums are, where the squirrels are. There's even a one-eyed coyote there as a resident amongst all things. But then, at the end of the showing, she brought me towards a relatively large building. It was wooden, but about the size of 2 cargo containers side by side, with a pretty hefty padlock and some bolts on the entrance, and what looked like a reinforced beam and walls all around. Most of the buildings that housed the refuge animals were in mild disrepair, only as well maintained as they needed to be. But this one looked like someone was taking care of it and repairing it on a weekly basis, if not more frequent. The lady explained to me that this is where they kept the resident deer, Bambi. She had lapsed the name, but then I remembered from reading in the handbook that wildlife refuges aren't even supposed to even have deer, let alone make them a resident, since they're so high maintenance and such a hassle to deal with. I asked her why we had Bambi then, and she explained. Yes, well, Bambi's sort of a special case. It's a bit complicated as to why, but all you need to know is that you don't have to feed her or anything. I do that myself, since she's a bit much to handle at times. Right as she finished her explanation, there was a loud bang from the enclosure that Bambi was housed in. That both looked like and felt like that it had shook the foundations of the place. For a moment, I worried that the walls would collapse and an angry deer would come rushing out. But that thankfully didn't happen. Seemed like she's energetic today. I might need some sedatives when I go in. It wasn't strange for the refuge to use sedatives. They were dealing with wild animals, after all. But my mind was immediately struck with the image of this slightly tubby, middle-aged lady taking down a deer with a tranquilizer rifle, which I laughed about a little to myself. I put my concerns about this deer out of my mind though, and just focused on getting trained for the job. Whenever I was near Bambi's building though, I would sometimes hear what I would assume, based on my naive experience from watching too many nature shows, was a deer call. But it was deeper, almost grumbling, much like a large predator animal would make. Plenty of the animals in the refuge made noises, some almost constantly, but the sounds Bambi's were making were quite unsettling compared to what the other animals sounded like. Again, though, I tried not to worry about it, and my first few days working at the wildlife refuge went fine. Sunday before last, though, I saw something that started to make me a bit more concerned about what was going on with Bambi. The lady who ran the place had explicitly told me that she fed Bambi after we closed up shop, around 6 p.m., because the deer were nocturnal and night eaters. I knew that nocturnal deer existed, so this wasn't too worrisome for me. What was worrisome was that what I saw when I was sitting out in my car after my shift was over, texting a friend about my dinner plan. It looked like the manager was making her way over to feed Bambi, and she was carrying 2 things with her as she approached the enclosure. The first was a tranquilizer rifle, at which point I had small, nervous chuckle at my previous idea actually ending up being true. And the second thing was a bag full of something that looked deep red and full of liquid. What I saw in the bag was unmistakable. Even from the distance I was at, it was a bag full of raw, bloody meat, enough to feed a group of 20 people at a steakhouse with 2 servings each, if not more. Now, I knew that some deer had been shown to eat meat under specific circumstances, so the concept of Bambi having some steak for dinner wasn't that concerned to me. Instead, it was the sheer amount of raw flesh that was being brought in by the manager and the fact that it seemed to be only food that she was bringing in. I know that the deer can eat meat, but I'm fairly certain that there's no species of deer that eats only meat. They can be omnivorous, but I've never heard of a purely carnivorous deer. Worried that the manager might get mad if she knew I was watching, I ducked under the dashboard and waited for her to go in, then quickly drove off for dinner with my friends, putting the image of that bag full of raw meat from my mind, as I coincidentally enough had some hamburgers to eat. Now, that could have easily been the end of it, and I had just minded my own business afterwards. But, as any good, no sleeper, my curiosity is too far to be suppressed by common sense. Between the noises that no deer should make, the regular shaking and crashing coming from inside the Bambi's enclosure, and now knowing what deer's daily dinner consisted of, I had to go look. I just had to. I had been entrusted with the keys to the animals' cages and enclosures on my second week, and I quickly realized that there was one key on the ring I didn't use for anything on my daily routine. I figure that it must be to some place that wasn't being used, or maybe that had been decommissioned, or something like that, and I didn't overthink it at the time. This past Sunday, though, I had an idea, one that turned out to be right. I don't know why the manager would keep a key to Bambi's enclosure on the ring that all of her volunteers use, but I wasn't about to question her oversight. I had made my way to the building once I was sure the manager would be busy for a while with some of her office work, and slowly and steadily approached the entrance. I was used to Bambi's banging up against the walls whenever anyone got close, but it still startled me every time it happened. Now, more than ever, more importantly, I hoped that all the noise the deer was making wasn't alerting the manager as to what I was trying to do. Eventually, after what felt like minutes of tiptoeing to the door, I managed to reach the padlock and tried the key. It went in on the first try, which somehow didn't come as a surprise to me. A few bolts later, and I managed to open the front door and opened into an airlock of Bambi's enclosure. All of the other enclosures have a similar system to keep them from getting out whenever we go in to feed or clean them, so this wasn't surprising. What was surprising was just how secure the inner door of the airlock was. If the outer door felt like a bank vault, then the inner door felt like Fort Knox. There must have been 4 or 5 different locks, all of which used the same key, thankfully, and at least half a dozen different bolts. The door itself was heavily reinforced and felt like, from pushing on it, like it must have weighed quite a bit. Of course, all of these precautions made sense given the strength of Bambi, which I regularly noticed shook the building and was desperately trying to contain her. Right as I had that thought, another such banging came from just inside, along the wall. Thankfully, not on the door, which I felt far louder than it normally was from being inside the building. I silently cursed under my breath at the ruckus Bambi was making and started to undo the inside locks. Normally, we're supposed to secure the outer door of the airlock before opening the inner door, but I wanted to keep an escape route, so to say. I didn't have any plan for Bambi breaking out entirely, but I figured out that I would cross that bridge when I came to it. Once all the locks and the bolts were undone, I very, very slowly opened the door which was just about as heavy as I thought it would be. My heart pounding in my chest from both nerves and anticipation. This stupid deer that had been in the periphery of my mind for the past month would finally be before my eyes, and I was both excited and terrified. The moment I cracked open the entrance, though the smell hit me before I could see anything, I was vaguely aware of it while outside the building, and slightly more so while in the airlock. But once I opened the door, it slammed into me like a big truck. It was the smell of rotten meat, decaying flesh, and all of the nastiness that comes with those things. The buzzing of flies filled the air as I had to repress the urge to vomit from the stench. Did this deer even know how to finish her dinner? I heard the buzzing of flies, but no other sound from inside. No snorting, no growling, no stamping of hooves. Nothing. On one hand, I was relieved that I wasn't promptly being charged by an angry deer, but on the other hand, I began to worry that she might be getting ready to ambush me. Did deer even know how to ambush people? As I opened the door a bit more, the first thing I noticed were the eyes. The inside of the enclosure was pretty dark. Few lights embedded the ceiling, a number of them broken, being the only things that illuminated the place since it had no windows. That being said, the two deep red orbs on the deer's face looked like they were glowing embers of fire, and felt like they had the ferocity to match. The second thing that I noticed was her mouth. It was stained red in what I assumed was blood. It looked as though it was continuously frothing, almost making me think of rabies. But we were supposed to put down any animals with rabies, so that couldn't be what this was. The third thing that I noticed were the antlers. I knew that female reindeer could grow antlers. This was no reindeer. Not by far. In fact, given the general mass and size of the deer in question, I wasn't even sure that she was any species of deer that I knew of all. Have you ever heard of Samson, the draft horse? He was over 7 feet tall and weighed a little over 1.5 tons. I'm pretty sure that Bambi herself was at least a bit larger than Samson, with some extra muscle mass to boot. Everything about the deer screamed predator, from the rippling muscles to the massive hooves, and I'm fairly certain that one should never get the feeling of predator from a deer in the first place. Bambi's antlers began to scratch along the roof as it started to make its way towards me. Its legs, having enough force behind them to vertebrae, shake the ground with each step it took. Oh God, it was making its way towards me. I tried to shut the door as fast as I could, but in my fascination with the creature, I had ended up opening it way too far. That Bambi had enough time to charge its way over to the lodge and open it with its antlers. At this point, I was cursing all of the curiosity that I'd ever had in my life, and my veins began to flood with adrenaline as I fought for what I may know to be my life. This thing would kill me if it got the chance, and probably would eat me like whatever meat the manager had been feeding it thus far. I quickly realized that there was no way I was going to win a contest of strength with Bambi, especially not against her antlers, and stopped trying to get the door shut. Instead, I grabbed my keyring, put a few keys through the space between my fingers, like I learned in self-defense class, and stabbed at Bambi's neck. I knew that this refuge was here to help animals stay safe and protect them from stuff like this and rehabilitate them. But quite frankly, I'd rather kill an animal that I'm supposed to be taken care of than let some gigantic mutant fuckhead deer have me for dinner. Well, all morality of it aside, it was still a pretty bad idea either way. The keys stabbed as far as they could into Bambi's neck, maybe an inch at the most. But they didn't seem to do much, except make her angry. A second after my mind had time to process how bad of a decision that was, Bambi reared up on her hind legs. How she did that in a building with such a low ceiling, I'm not so sure. She kicked forward, bashing the door open, And the only reason I survived that strike was because the door itself. As strong as it was, it took enough of the force that I was simply knocked flat on my ass. I was fairly certain, however, that I wasn't going to stay alive for much longer, given that Bambi was now staring down at me with those crimson eyes of hers that gleamed violence and hunger with a glance of light that hit them. I assumed she was going to rear up again in order to stomp me into the ground like meat. But instead, she started to lean down. I wasn't quite sure what she was doing for a few seconds until she opened her mouth. Let me say right now that deer are not supposed to have teeth like that. Incisors, as sharp as knives and about as long, from front to back, about as many as a shark is supposed to have, if not more, with serrated edges. I was fairly certain that Bambi could actually kill and eat a shark if she tried. Viscera and gore were stuck between those monstrous teeth of hers, and as she got closer, I nearly passed out from the smell of all the raw meat on her breath, the temperature of which was almost hot enough to scald my skin. For a moment, I said every prayer from every religion that I could remember, preparing myself for whatever afterlife I would be soon heading to. In the moment that I thought that Bambi was going to chop down on my head. Though, she didn't. Instead, I heard a thwip sound come from behind me, and the deer whined, and what I presumed was some sort of pain. The sound was just still as deep, and if not deeper than a lion's roar, and it retreated back inside of its enclosure. In that second, after that, I thanked my lack of caution for not locking the outside door of the airlock, as the manager was standing there with the tranquilizer rifle I had seen with her before. The lady was angry, sure enough, and I assumed her for a moment that she was just going to shoot me with the rifle next and throw me in there for Bambi to eat. Instead, she went to the door. She locked it as tightly as she could and held me up. I told you to let me handle Bambi, didn't I? That she did. That she did. Between the sheer shock of the situation, my good sense not to push her any further, I didn't really ask any questions about what was up with Bambi, why we were keeping her, or exactly what kind of meat she was eating. The lady didn't fire me or anything either, and I'm still planning on going to work next weekend. But I think I'll be staying away from Bambi's enclosure from now on. I'd rather not end up as the contents of some giant flesh-eating deer's stomach.